Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Tonight begins with a question most never dare to ask out loud. Not because it's frightening, but because it's too strange to hold in the daylight. Why is there something instead of nothing? Not just galaxies and governments and guitars, but anything at all. Why does existence exist? Why wasn't there simply nothing? No time, no space, no atoms humming or lovers meeting or leaves trembling in the wind? Just absolute stillness, absolute absence. That question, simple, soft, enormous, has haunted thinkers for centuries. And it doesn't get answered. It gets deeper, it gets heavier, it gets softer around the edges until it slips into the space between breathing and dreaming. That's where we'll be staying tonight. Somewhere between science and silence, between logic and wonder. So if that's the kind of place you like to rest your thoughts, gently like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We post one of these every night, so there's always something strange and sleepy waiting for you. And before we fall too deep into the void, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We'd love to know which corners of the universe are drifting off with us. Now let's go back, not in time, but before time. Not to the Big Bang, but before the bang. Before space, before atoms, before cause and effect. What was there? Nothing, perhaps. But what is nothing? That word gets used like it's simple, empty, hollow, zero. But philosophers don't trust it. Heidegger called nothing the most overlooked concept in all of thought. He said, "Nothing nothings," which sounds ridiculous until it doesn't, until the mind starts to grasp that nothing might not be empty at all. It might be a kind of fullness too strange for language, a silence so complete it trembles, and yet we are here. So something happened. Something ruptured the stillness. Something snapped nothing into being. The Greeks called it the arche, the first principle, the primal cause. They argued about it. Was it water, as Thales believed? Was it air? Was it boundless potential, as Anaximander claimed? Each tried to find a root, a source, a ground. But no matter what they picked, the same question lingered. What made that? And what made that? And what made that infinite regress? A staircase with no bottom. So thinkers began to say, maybe there was an unmoved mover, like Aristotle imagined, a being that causes all but is not itself caused. Or maybe the universe is just a brute fact, like Bertrand Russell once shrugged. The universe is just there, and that's all. But is that enough? Does that satisfy the itch, or does it only mute the scream? Leibniz didn't think it was enough. He believed there must be a sufficient reason, that everything must have an explanation, even the whole of existence. And so he asked, why is there something rather than nothing? That question is often misinterpreted as spiritual, but it's more fundamental than that. It's metaphysical. It applies even in a godless void. Because even if a God made the universe, why does that God exist? And why this God and not another? And why at all? The mind collapses in these loops, but the heart feels something, a strange ache, a quiet terror, a kind of awe. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that existence is a scandal, that there is no reason for it, that being simply happens, absurdly, stubbornly, without justification, and that's what makes it unbearable and beautiful. The philosopher Derek Parfit offered a haunting idea that nothing is actually simpler than something, because nothing requires no explanation, no complexity, no laws, no structures, just the absence of all. So then why is simplicity not what we got? Why not the default? Why not nothing forever? Instead, we got stars, oceans, kisses, war, breath, laughter, consciousness, a mess, a miracle, a middle finger to entropy. What cracked the silence? Physics has its guesses. Theories of quantum fluctuations, of virtual particles bubbling in a vacuum. But those theories still assume a kind of canvas, a space, a field, a law. They do not begin with truly nothing, because perhaps we cannot. Perhaps humans are structurally incapable of conceiving true nothingness. Because we are made of being, of nerves and blood and breath, how does something that is imagine not being? Even death is imagined as a hallway, a fog, a dreamless sleep. Still something, still a metaphor, never the void. And that tells us something, that maybe the mystery is not out there, but in here, in the mind that wonders, in the self that asks, in the strange, luminous fact that thought exists at all, that we can question, that we can ache, that we can dream about the impossible. That, too, is a kind of miracle, a kind of breach in nothingness. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, believed that meaning is not found, but made, that we must create it, that the absence of explanation is not a failure, but an invitation, an open stage, a blank page, and that is terrifying, but also freeing, because if nothingness is the default, then being is rebellion, then to exist is to defy, to say yes to absurdity, to become the echo that nothingness never wanted, and in that echo is choice, or at least a kind of poetry. So tonight we sit with the question, not to answer it, but to feel it, to hold it gently in the dark, like a flickering candle. Why is there something instead of nothing? No one knows, no one can, but maybe the asking is what makes us real. What if the reason we cannot answer the question is because we are part of the question itself? What if being cannot see its own origin, because the origin was never an event, but a condition, an invisible threshold that cannot be witnessed from inside the system it gave rise to? It's like trying to see the back of one's own head without a mirror, or trying to remember the moment before birth. Consciousness is locked in place, bound to the rhythms of time and space, unable to pierce the veil from which time and space emerged. And yet we keep trying, not because we expect answers, but because the question itself is sacred, like a prayer with no listener, like a scream that doesn't want to be heard, only released. The ancient philosophers of India had a concept called neti neti, not this, not that, a method of peeling reality by denying each thing as the ultimate. Not this world, not that God, not this form. And what remains is not a thing at all, but awareness itself. A kind of being without quality, a presence without edge, a field that simply is, and perhaps that is what we call existence. Not a thing that began, but a field that cannot not be. Some called it Brahman, some called it the Tao, some just left it unnamed, because naming is a form of containment, and containment might be a lie. But others pushed in the other direction. The philosopher Parmenides, writing before Socrates, made the radical claim that nothing does not exist, that to even speak of nothing is to grant it being. So for him, only being exists. It always has. It always will. It cannot change. It cannot emerge. It simply is. And the world of appearances, change, motion, birth, death, is illusion. Mere opinion. A dream. If he's right, then the question, why is there something instead of nothing, is malformed. Because nothing was never a real option. Being is the only game in town. But that answer, though elegant, is deeply unsatisfying to a mind that craves story, that needs narrative. We want there to be a reason. We want a spark, a seed, a cause. We want the tale of how nothing cracked and let light bleed in, even if it's myth, even if it's metaphor. Because stories are how minds hold the infinite. They wrap it in symbols, in scenes, in logic, even if the logic is false, even if the scene is impossible. That's why Genesis begins with darkness and light, why creation myths often involve a void, a womb, a cosmic egg. Something had to rupture, something had to become, but rupture assumes time, becoming assumes a before. And time, according to physics, is not fundamental. It may be emergent, a feature of our perception, not a trait of reality. So maybe nothingness and somethingness were never at war. Maybe they coexist, maybe they're the same. That is the unsettling idea offered by quantum field theory. that the vacuum of space, what we call empty, is not truly empty. It teems with potential. Virtual particles blinking in and out of existence. Energy fluctuations occurring without cause. A restless void. A fertile emptiness. So maybe being didn't emerge. Maybe it flickers. Maybe existence is not a fact but a pattern. A probability wave collapsing into now. And maybe the question, why is there something instead of nothing, is like asking why a wave crests at a certain moment. The question assumes solidity, but reality may be smoke, mist, movement, and still the ache remains, the ache for a beginning, for a first cause, for a truth with no parent. Aristotle tried to give us one with his concept of the unmoved mover, a being who initiates motion, but is not moved itself. But even that feels like a trick, like moving the mystery one step back, then declaring victory. Because even an unmoved mover must be. And being is what we're trying to explain. And perhaps we can't. Because we are being, and being cannot stand outside itself to ask how it began. That's the loop, the trap, the mirror maze. And yet we walk it. Every mystic, every philosopher, every child staring into the night sky has felt it, that tingling dread, that soft panic, that trembling awe, that moment where the mind looks around and realizes it has no ground, no bedrock, just layers upon layers of mystery. We live our lives suspended in midair, pretending there's a floor, and perhaps we must. Perhaps sanity depends on not staring into the abyss too long, but sometimes, in the quiet, the abyss stares back. And it doesn't threaten, it just waits, it just is. And that is what makes it holy, or horrifying, or both. Thomas Aquinas believed that the question of being had to end in a necessary being, a thing that must exist, that cannot not exist. He called it God. But modern philosophers are less sure. They see the gaps, the assumptions, the leaps. They sense that necessary may just be. Another word for unexplained. And so we orbit, we build models, we test particles, we write poems, all trying to touch the untouchable, to understand why anything exists at all. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the question is not a riddle to solve, but a doorway to reverence. A reminder that everything we see, everything we know, everything we are, rests on a silence we cannot hear. And that silence is not empty. It is sacred, because it holds the unspeakable truth that we are here. And we don't know why, and we never will, but we can wonder, and sometimes that's enough. There's a strange kind of quiet that enters the room when a mind begins to genuinely consider that everything could have not been. Not just the absence of humans or planets or galaxies, but the absence of the very conditions for anything at all. No time ticking, no particles dancing, no laws humming in the background. Not even emptiness, not even blackness. Just no. And yet, here we are, waking, walking, worrying, falling in love, paying bills, laughing at cats. The sheer absurdity of it goes unnoticed most of the time. And perhaps that's mercy. If the weight of being pressed on us constantly, we might collapse. We might refuse to get out of bed. Because how does one act normally knowing that normality itself was never promised? There is no guarantee, no reason, no necessity that anything had to happen. And yet, things happened. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, soaked in gloom and honesty, once wrote that it would have been better had the world never existed. That being is a burden, a mistake, a suffering machine. But even Schopenhauer, with all his pessimism, couldn't explain why there is something at all. He only explained why it hurts. And maybe that's the problem. We confuse the pain of being with its origin. We assume that suffering must mean something went wrong, that if we're hurting, there must have been a flaw in the design. But what if pain is just the texture of being? What if feeling is the cost of existence? What if the universe doesn't owe us comfort, only awareness? The physicist Sean Carroll once remarked that the laws of physics don't care about purpose. They don't even require a beginning. Some models suggest the universe could be eternal in both directions, stretching infinitely into the past and future, with no edge, no origin, just a vast, self-sustaining rhythm of cause and effect. But that doesn't feel right, does it? Intuitively, the mind resists. It wants a starting line. It wants a moment where the curtain rose. Maybe that's because we're biological creatures, born into time, built to expect a sequence. Every story we know has a beginning. Every life we see has a birth. So we project that shape onto the cosmos. But perhaps the cosmos doesn't share our shape. Perhaps it never began. Perhaps existence is not a line, but a loop, or a web, or something even stranger, something for which we have no metaphor. That's why metaphysics is so slippery. It reaches past the edge of language, into places where our symbols fail, and yet humans return to the same symbols again and again. Light, darkness, the void, the egg, the breath, the word. In the book of Genesis, creation begins not with a bang, but with a sentence. Let there be light. As if existence is not material first, but linguistic. As if reality begins when it's spoken. This idea reappears in many traditions. In Hindu cosmology, the sound Om is said to be the vibration of existence itself, the original note from which all arises. In the Gospel of John, the opening line reads, "In the beginning was the Word," not the particle, not the force, the Word, a vibration, a meaning, a symbol. It's as if deep down, humanity senses that reality is not just atoms bouncing in a void, but meaning unfolding through form. Not random, not necessary. Something else, something stranger, something sacred, even if godless. And yet sacredness is hard to hold without a framework. So we build religions, we invent gods, we paint mythologies across the night sky to comfort the ache of not knowing. But even gods need explanations. Even creators must be accounted for. So the question digs deeper. Why anything? Why being? Why now? The philosopher Martin Heidegger believed this question, the question of being, is the most fundamental inquiry of philosophy. But he warned that language fails us here, that the word being has been diluted, domesticated, made too small. He urged us to see being not as a category, but as a mystery, not something to define, but something to encounter. Like fog, like music, like grief, real but untouchable, present but ungraspable. And that encounter is not comfortable. It destabilizes, because to feel the weight of being is to feel the ground slip. To realize that existence has no floor, only depth, only layers, only echoes. This is why some mystics go silent, why they retreat into caves and deserts and sit in stillness for years. Not to escape the world, but to feel it more fully, to hear the background hum of being itself. Not the contents of reality, but the condition for reality. Not the objects, but the field. And in that silence, many report the same experience, a sense of unity, of presence, of radical okayness, as if the question dissolves, as if the need for an answer was the problem, as if the answer was never a sentence but a state. But most of us don't get there. We stay in the churn, we chase the answers, we fill the void with theories and caffeine and entertainment. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to solve the mystery, just to dance with it, to be haunted and humbled by it, to look up at the stars not for navigation, but for awe. And maybe, in those rare moments when the mind goes still, when the chatter fades, when the air feels thick with meaning, we glimpse the truth, not as knowledge, but as a feeling, a throb, a shimmer, a whisper that says, "You are here," and that is already impossible. And then we go back to our tasks, our texts, our deadlines. But something lingers, a softness, a shift, a sense that beneath the noise, something is holding everything. Not a person, not a plan. Just being, undeserved, undeniable, unexplainable. Imagine the universe as a canvas with no edges, no frame, no beginning and no end. Just a stretch of being so vast and unbound that the very idea of a start becomes laughable. A child's question, but still. What dipped the brush into existence? What hand painted being where there could have been silence? Not the silence of a sleeping forest or an empty room, but the silence of never. No ears to hear, no eyes to close, no dimensions to cradle thought. Just never. But instead of never, there is now. There is something. And within that, something sits a mind, curious, confused, tired, soft. A mind trying to make sense of the fact that it exists. This is not abstract, it is immediate. It is as personal as a pulse. This very moment, right now, could have not been, and yet here it is. Here we are, flickering in and out of awareness, responding to light, forming language, asking questions. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote that not how the world is, but that it is the mystical. And that difference is everything. Most of the time we ask what things are. What is time? What is love? What is memory? But the real strangeness lies in the fact that there are things at all. That there is a what to ask about. That there is a stage for stories, a field for matter to dance upon. Scientists study particles and pressure, and energy and probability. They look for patterns, laws, regularities, but none of that explains why there's anything for laws to govern. Why there are particles to arrange, energies to measure, waves to collapse. Those are all what questions. And the question of being is a why. Or maybe not even a why, maybe it's a how. Or a what before the what. The kind of question that makes your stomach ache a little, makes the air feel thinner. Because it breaks the rules of daily thinking. It bends the structures. And some people don't like that. They retreat. They say it's meaningless. That the question is malformed. That non-being isn't a real possibility, so there's nothing to explain. That being is just the way it is, but that's a dodge. And philosophers like Leibniz and Heidegger didn't buy it. Because to say it just is to surrender curiosity. It's to clip the wings of wonder before they even flutter. Because even if nothing was never a true option, we must ask, why does being feel so contingent? Why does it feel like it could vanish? Why does the human heart feel the fragility of it all? If being is necessary, why does it tremble? Why do stars die? Why do minds break? Why do moments disappear without warning? That tension, that beauty wrapped in terror, is the texture of being. It's what makes sunsets feel holy. What makes music feel like memory? What makes goodbye ache deeper than we expect? Because every moment is haunted by the ghost of what could have not been. And that ghost walks beside us, quiet, patient, not malicious, just present, just honest. And sometimes if you listen, it whispers, "This is all so fragile." And it's true. Planets crash, bodies rot, empires fall, lovers leave, thoughts fade, everything changes. And yet the background hum, the fact of existence remains. Through every death, every silence, every forgetting, being keeps being, which raises the question, what is this being that does not break? What is this substrate, this field, this ungraspable presence that holds all form, all loss, all motion? The philosopher Spinoza called it God or nature, one infinite substance with infinite attributes, of which thought and extension are two. He believed everything that exists is a mode of this one substance, that nothing is truly separate, that the self is not a thing but a way of being. And if that's true, then asking, why is there something rather than nothing, might be like asking, why does water ripple? Rippling is just something water does, and maybe being is just what the real does, but that still leaves us aching, because ripples have shapes, they appear and disappear. They carry light, and we are those shapes, we are those temporary swirls, and we want to know why, not just how, not just that, but why, even if the answer is silence, even if the answer is laughter, even if the answer is a mirror that reflects the one asking. That's why some turn to mysticism, not to escape the question, but to dissolve it, to stop seeing the world as a problem, and start seeing it as a poem, to stop dissecting and start listening, to trade explanation for experience, to sit by the river of being and just feel its coolness. And in that feeling, something changes. The need for a cause softens, the urgency fades, the edges blur, and what's left is presence, naked, intimate, undeniable, but the mind returns. It always returns. It asks again, because that's what minds do. They dig, they itch, they orbit the same unanswerable question. Why something? Why not nothing? And round we go, like a record stuck in a groove, like a prayer that repeats not for answers, but for rhythm, for connection, for comfort. Because maybe the comfort is not in the knowing, but in the asking, in the company of those who ask, in the silence we share after the words run out. That silence too is something, and that in itself is a miracle. Some questions do not demand answers, only the dignity of being asked. Why is there something instead of nothing is one of those sacred questions. A question so old it predates words, so strange it disrupts sleep, so quiet it hums beneath all thought like a low vibration in the soul. Most of the time, it waits behind the noise, behind bills and deadlines and texts and small talk. But sometimes, in the early morning or the deep night, it wakes up. It peers through the cracks. It whispers, what if none of this had happened? Not just your life, not just the planet, but everything. What if the entire stage never existed? No physics, no colours, no textures, no touch, no watcher, no absence to notice the absence, just not anything. And that is not depression or philosophy. It is something prior, something deeper, a trembling at the root of being. Blaise Pascal once said that the eternal silence of these infinite spaces terrified him. But maybe silence is not terrifying because it's empty. Maybe it's terrifying because it is full of potential, full of meaning we cannot read, full of truths too vast to be cradled by thought. In some Buddhist schools, they speak of shunyata, emptiness, not as a void, but as a fullness beyond form, a reality beyond concepts. Not nothingness, but no-thingness, a state where all distinctions dissolve, where being and non-being merge, where the dance continues, but the dancer is gone. And maybe, just maybe, this helps us understand the absurdity of our question. Because perhaps being was never chosen, never created, never summoned. Perhaps it simply is, and always was, and always will be. Not like a god watching from the clouds, not like a machine starting from a button, but like a fire that burns because it is fire, like a breath that breathes because it must. And yet, even if being is eternal, the question still hangs. Why this form? Why these laws? Why this particular pattern of stars and gravity and math and hunger and hope and loneliness? Out of all the possible ways existence could have unfolded, why this one? Why a universe where particles become people, and people ask about particles? Why a cosmos that becomes aware of itself? This is not a trivial curiosity. It is the soft scream of a conscious mind trying to place itself, trying to locate the edge of the infinite, trying to understand how the question and the questioner emerged from the same mystery. Leibniz thought the answer must involve God, a perfect being who creates the best of all possible worlds. But that idea has aged poorly, because our world is not perfect. It is beautiful, yes, but also broken, also brutal, also confused. So if this is the best possible world, what does that say about the other options? And who defines best? From the perspective of a cancer cell, endless division is a triumph. From the perspective of a child in pain, the world is not best. It is cruel, arbitrary, unjust, and yet it is. That is the central fact we return to. It is. The sun rises, the heart beats, the silence between stars stretches out endlessly, and in that silence sits a mind, asking why. Not to fix anything, not to argue, just to feel the weight of the question, just to touch the edge of what cannot be touched. The theologian Paul Tillich described God not as a being, but as being itself. Not a thing among things, but the ground of all things. A depth, an abyss, a presence too vast to name. And in that framing, the question changes. It becomes less about origin and more about presence, less about how something began and more about how we stand within it, how we relate to the mystery, whether we resist it or surrender, whether we demand meaning or create it, whether we scream into the void or learn to sing with it. And maybe that's the real evolution, not biological but existential, the shift from needing to know why to learning how to live inside the question, to breathe it in, to walk with it, to let it wash over the bones without drowning. And that's not easy, especially in a culture that worships certainty, that sells answers like candy, that treats questions as problems, not pathways. But philosophy is not problem solving. It is problem deepening. It is the art of staring into the abyss without blinking, of holding paradox without panic, of letting the mind stretch until it cracks open like a seed. And when it does, what spills out is not truth, but tenderness, a softness, a willingness to not know. And in that not knowing, something shifts. The world becomes more alive, more holy, more absurd, more real, because once you accept that you will never know why anything exists, you begin to cherish that it does. You stop demanding explanation and start noticing texture. The way light bends through a window. The way breath fogs against glass. The way a stranger laughs in a grocery store, unaware that they are a miracle. Not because they're special, but because they are. Because they exist. And that is always impossible. Always sacred, always enough. And yet the question returns. It always returns. It taps the shoulder in the middle of a task. It whispers behind the music. It waits at the end of every sentence. Why something? Why not nothing? And maybe that's not a question to answer. Maybe it's a mantra, a meditation, a mirror, a reminder that we are suspended in mystery. And that mystery is not a flaw. It is the fabric of being. It's strange how something can feel both eternal and fragile at the same time. How the fact of existence can seem unshakable, so deeply rooted that it transcends questioning, and yet, in the quiet hours of night, feel like a delicate illusion that could vanish with a blink, as if reality is held together by breath alone. A breath we all share, but do not control. A breath that never began and cannot stop. Not because of design, but because stopping was never an option to begin with. It is in this tension that the human mind tries to live, swinging back and forth between wonder and despair, awe and absurdity, comfort and vertigo. Because to live inside a universe that doesn't need to exist is to constantly be balancing on the edge of something unknowable, and perhaps nothing captures this more clearly than the realization that no one, not gods, not scientists, not philosophers, has ever answered the question, why does anything exist at all? Some claim we've made progress, that cosmology and physics have cracked open the origins of the universe, tracing the birth of matter and energy back to the Big Bang. But even that event, magnificent as it sounds, is not an origin. It's a middle, a chapter, not the book itself, because the Big Bang still assumes a framework, a possibility space within which such an explosion could occur, still assumes the laws of mathematics, the conditions of logic, the coherence of pattern, and the moment you ask why those things exist, science can only shrug, and philosophers can only speculate. There is a haunting irony in this, that the most advanced minds in history have charted the motion of galaxies and the structure of atoms, but cannot say why there's anything to study in the first place, why the stage exists, why the lights are on, why there are rules at all. And maybe there's a clue there. That explanation might always fall short when the thing we're trying to explain is the foundation of explanation itself. The reason we can't step outside being to understand it is because there is no outside, because being contains all outsides and insides alike, because outside being is a phrase that collapses under its own weight. This is what the German idealist Schelling meant when he said, "The abyss that lies beneath everything is not nothing, but the groundless ground of being." Groundless ground. It sounds like a contradiction, but maybe that's the only kind of truth we can expect at this level of inquiry. One that doesn't resolve, but reveals, doesn't answer, but awakens. And yet the ache remains, because we are not abstract beings. We are embodied. We live in time. We move through loss and touch and longing. We want stories, not just structures. We want to know not just how things are, but why we care that they are. And perhaps this craving for meaning is not a bug, but a feature. Perhaps it is the very thing that connects us to the question itself. Because it's not just that there is something rather than nothing, it's that the something can feel. That being produces awareness. That awareness produces suffering and joy and confusion and love. That the universe gave rise to creatures who ask about the universe. That, in a sense, being became curious about itself. Alan Watts used to say that the universe is playing a game of hide and seek with itself, that we are all it, pretending we are not, and that enlightenment is the moment we remember. But even if that's true, it still leaves open the question, why the game at all? Why not just stillness? Why not remain in the silence forever? And the only answer that ever comes, if it comes at all, is a smile. A smile that doesn't explain but invites, that says, look, listen, this is happening. And maybe that's enough. But the mind resists. The mind wants more. It wants certainty. It wants to pin the infinite like a butterfly and name it. So it invents gods. Not out of stupidity, but necessity. Because gods give shape to the formless, give story to the mystery, give structure to the abyss. But even the gods must be asked, why? Why you? Why this form? Why at all? And so the question passes from science to philosophy to theology and back again, like a ghost haunting every system, refusing to be silenced because at the end of every logic chain, every metaphysical proof, every sacred text lies the same trembling truth. It could have been otherwise, or it could have been nothing, and we don't know why it wasn't. This is not nihilism, it is not despair, it is reverence. To feel this question deeply is not to lose meaning, but to multiply it, to recognize that every moment, every breath, every glance and gesture and dream is suspended in something unspeakable, something unearned, something impossible. And in that light, existence becomes luminous, fragile, astonishing. We begin to see the miracle in the mundane, the way dust hangs in sunlight, the way a voice cracks with feeling, the way hands reach across tables for comfort. We stop needing a reason and start witnessing the reality. And that witnessing is sacred. It is a kind of prayer, a silent prayer to the fact of being, a thank you that can't be spoken because there's no one to thank, only the thankfulness itself, rising up like mist from the soul. And maybe that's the closest we'll ever get to an answer. Not a sentence, but a state of mind. Not a theory, but a tenderness. Not a conclusion, but a curiosity that never ends. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because there is, and we are part of that is, and that is always, always enough. There is a peculiar loneliness in the question itself, the question that drips slowly like water from a cracked ceiling. Why is there something rather than nothing? It is a question that cannot be asked with others. It resists parties, jokes, crowds. It waits for silence. It waits until the TV has gone black, until the phone is quiet, until the sky outside the window has turned the colour of old ink. And then it stirs. Not violently, not loudly, but like a chill, like the soft turning of the soul toward the edge of thought. Why is there something? Why am I here to notice it? Why do I have eyes and language and longing and memories of things that never happened? Most people, understandably, turn away, not because they're shallow, but because they have lives to live, groceries to carry, people to hold. But the question does not resent being ignored. It waits, it is patient, And when you return to it, it welcomes you like an old friend who has not aged. And so we sit with it, again, trying to press against its contours, trying to see if it will crack, if it will yield anything other than mystery. Because the alternatives are strange. Either being had no cause, or it caused itself, or it has always been. Each possibility is unbearable in its own way. If being had no cause, then we must accept a rupture in logic, a spontaneous unfolding from pure absence. But how can absence unfold? How can nothing give birth to anything, even the smallest particle? If being caused itself, we're left with paradox. Something cannot precede itself. A fire cannot light itself without fuel. A circle cannot draw itself before it exists. And if being has always been, then we are back to the eternal, a concept that stretches the mind until it snaps, until we can no longer tell whether we are thinking or hallucinating. These are not puzzles to solve, they are thresholds, and stepping across them requires not answers, but courage. The courage to not look away, to let the question do its work, to let it soften the ego and silence the frantic need to fix everything with knowledge. Because maybe knowledge is not what we need. Maybe what we need is humility. The kind of humility that sees a grain of sand and realizes it contains the same strangeness as the cosmos. The kind that hears a baby cry and recognizes it as the sound of being asserting itself against the dark. Because being does assert itself. That much is clear. It doesn't just exist, it insists. It echoes, it builds, it breaks, it heals, it remembers, and we are its instruments, its eyes, its ache, its question, and maybe that's the whole point. Not that we find the answer, but that we embody the question so deeply that the answer no longer matters. This was the posture of the mystics, not the theologians or the metaphysicians, but those who stared into the fire long enough to become it. Those who let go of the need to label and instead chose to kneel, to breathe, to burn. Meister Eckhart, the German mystic, once said, "God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction." What if the same is true of being? What if we understand existence not by adding facts, but by peeling away illusion? What if the more we unlearn, the closer we get to the pulse of reality? And that pulse, what does it feel like? Not a theory, not a law, but a rhythm, a hum, a warmth in the spine when someone says your name softly, a crack in the voice of someone remembering the dead, a laugh that surprises itself. These are moments where the curtain pulls back just slightly, not enough to see the machinery, but enough to feel the air shift, enough to know that something beyond comprehension is happening. And it's not abstract, it's intimate, immediate, alive. And so we turn again to the philosophers, not for conclusions, but for companionship. Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century, taught that all things emanate from the One, the source of being, perfect and undivided. From the One comes the intellect, from intellect, the soul, from the soul, the world. And the journey of the philosopher is to return inward, upward, to the One, not by climbing, but by surrendering, by dissolving into the truth that we are not separate from the source. We are the source, dreaming separation. This dream, what a strange one it is. A dream where atoms sing and flowers wilt and people forget each other's birthdays. A dream where children believe the moon follows their car at night. A dream where history repeats, not because it must, but because we refuse to learn. And yet, the dream is tender. It hurts, it heals, it matters. And that is the greatest paradox of all, that something so fragile, so fleeting, so full of contradiction can still feel meaningful. That meaning can emerge from a question with no answer, that purpose can bloom in soil without roots. Maybe that's the lesson. That being does not require a justification, that it justifies itself by being, that existence is not waiting for approval. It is already enough, already radiant, already complete. And we who ask and ache and fall asleep mid-thought, we are part of that radiance. We are flickers of the same flame. And that flame, whether it began or always burned, shows no sign of ending. The question never dies. It simply changes costume, slips into new languages, hides beneath different metaphors. But it is always the same question, quietly pulsing beneath all thought. Why is there something rather than nothing? Sometimes it wears the robe of religion, sometimes the lab coat of science, sometimes the weary cloak of a poet watching the world fall asleep through a fogged window. But it always returns because it's not merely a curiosity. It is the root of all other thoughts, the seed from which wonder and anxiety grow side by side. And the deeper we sit with it, the more we begin to suspect that maybe this question is not meant to be answered, but felt like the slow pressure of water surrounding a diver, like the hush before thunder, like the strange recognition in a stranger's eyes. To ask why there is something is to confront the ultimate contingency of our lives, to see clearly that none of this was necessary. This room, this body, this voice, this sentence, it could have all not been. Not broken, not lost, not wrong, just never. And that is a truth so enormous, so quietly devastating, that most systems of thought try to bury it. They reach for gods, for blueprints, for cosmic clocks and universal logics, anything to deny the sheer weirdness of being. And yet, here it is. Here we are, existing in the middle of a question that cannot be answered with certainty or proof or scripture, but only with presence. Presence that listens rather than explains, that sits rather than solves. Sartre once wrote that existence is nauseating precisely because it's superfluous, because there is no reason for it to be, and yet it is. And that excess, that surplus of being, makes the stomach turn. But maybe nausea is just one reaction to wonder. Maybe awe and dread are two sides of the same flame. After all, the question, why is there something, is not just philosophical. It is biological, emotional, erotic. It pulses through everything, through the way we love, through the way we fear endings, through the way we name things only to watch them disappear. And in that pulse lives a paradox. Being feels so absolute and yet so fragile, so overwhelming yet so empty of reason. And perhaps that contradiction is what it means to be human. To live as a flicker in something that doesn't explain itself. To build meaning on a ground that never promised it would hold. And still we build. That's what makes the question sacred. Not that it leads to clarity, but that it draws us into creation, into poetry, into science, into myth. Every attempt to answer the question is, in its own way, an act of love, a refusal to let the silence have the last word. And yet, perhaps silence is the only appropriate response, not because there is no answer, but because any answer would shrink the question, would kill the magic, would turn the infinite into a diagram. That's what the mystics knew. The Sufis, the Zen monks, the desert hermits, they didn't solve the question, they danced with it. They lit candles and sang and watched clouds until the mind loosened its grip, until the need to know softened into a quiet reverence for the unknown. Because there is something liberating about admitting we don't know, not in the cynical sense, but in the childlike one, the kind that opens doors instead of closing them, the kind that hears "I don't know" as an invitation, not a defeat, and in that openness something shifts. The world becomes less like a machine and more like a dream, less like a puzzle and more like a prayer. Not a prayer to someone, just a prayer. A way of being in rhythm with the absurd. A willingness to hold the contradiction without collapsing. And maybe that's what the question teaches us. Not what is true, but how to live when truth slips through the fingers. How to love without knowing why. How to grieve without knowing what was lost. How to exist without demanding justification. And in that, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of surrender. Of letting go of the need to dominate the mystery and instead choosing to be held by it. To rest in the fact that we are here, that the breath keeps coming, that the stars still burn, that music still moves through the dark, and that somehow, impossibly, miraculously, nothing never came. Being did, being always does, and we are part of it, not as observers, as participants, as expressions, as questions folded into skin and story and sorrow. And that, in the end, might be all the answer we get. Some truths do not arrive with sound or proof. They arrive like a scent on the wind, like the hush before a snowfall, like a feeling that something impossible has been forgotten and is just about to be remembered. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, lives in that silent realm, not as a concept, but as a presence, a tension that cannot be named, a shape in the dark that cannot be drawn. And still, it shapes everything. It is the haunting backdrop behind all ambition, all art, all fear, all wonder. Because once the possibility of nothing is seen, really seen, everything changes. The sky becomes less like scenery and more like a miracle. Laughter becomes a form of defiance. Death becomes less frightening, more mysterious. And love becomes the most absurd thing of all. The choice to care, deeply, irrationally, within a reality that didn't have to be. This is not just poetic, it is foundational. Even physicists admit that the laws we take for granted, the fabric of space-time, the constants of motion, the strange behavior of quantum fields, none of these laws explain their own necessity. They describe how things behave, but not why those things exist to behave at all. Stephen Hawking once asked, "What is it that breathes fire into the equations? Why is there a universe for mathematics to apply to in the first place?" And no answer has arrived. No machine has whirred to life with the secret. Because there is no secret. There is only the question. And in that question, a universe. That's the contradiction, the strange loop, the thing that breaks the brain if stared at too long. And yet, that loop is everywhere. It echoes in myth and math and madness. It hides in the folds of language. Even the word nothing implies thing. It is not pure absence, it is a placeholder, a concept, a ghost of presence. We speak of nothing as if it's real, but it's always wrapped in being. We cannot even imagine true nothing, because imagination itself is something. Thought is something. The very awareness of absence is already a form of presence. And that may be the deepest clue of all, that being cannot be escaped, even in theory, that it envelops everything, even its own negation. This is what Heidegger meant when he spoke of the question of being as the most fundamental and yet most forgotten question in philosophy. Because to ask it is to step outside the usual games of knowledge and enter a different terrain entirely. A terrain where logic bends and silence speaks louder than words, where the most honest answer is not, "I know," but "I feel." I feel the weight of this question in my chest. I feel the miracle of this chair, this breath, this strange continuity of waking up each day into a world that should not be. Not because it is flawed, but because its very existence is surplus. A surplus that cannot be explained away, only honoured. And perhaps that is the task, to learn how to honour being, not to reduce it or explain it or tame it, but to meet it like a friend, with quiet eyes and open hands. To say, "I do not know why you are here, but thank you. Thank you for colour. Thank you for music. Thank you for the sound of rain and the heat of shame and the smell of old books. Thank you for giving me a chance to ask this question, even if I never receive an answer." And in that gratitude, something softens. The panic fades. The silence becomes less like a void and more like a cradle. Not empty, full of meaning that cannot be translated, full of stories that will never be told, full of beings who weep and wonder and wake up again. Maybe the point is not to understand why something exists, but to live in such a way that honours its strangeness. To live slowly, to love bravely, to ask impossible questions, not to solve them, but to stay human. Because humans are not engines, we are not calculators, we are animals of awe, we are shaped by mystery, moved by what we do not grasp. And that is not weakness, it is our glory. It is the reason we make art and kiss each other and stare too long at sunsets. It is the reason we mourn. To mourn is to recognize that something mattered, that it existed, and that it should not have disappeared. And mourning is only possible because being is precious. And being is precious because it is unnecessary. And it is unnecessary because we cannot find a reason for it that is not already within it. It loops, it folds, it escapes, and we chase it. We chase it in philosophy, in love, in violence, in prayer, and sometimes for a moment we catch it in the curve of a cheek, in the stillness after music ends, in the way a child whispers, "Look," with trembling excitement, and then it's gone again. And that's okay, because the fact that we caught it at all is already a kind of answer. Not the one we wanted, but maybe the one we needed. There is a moment when looking up at the stars at midnight that the question pulses in the chest. Why does anything exist at all? Not why the stars or the planets or even life, but why existence itself. It is not a question of utility, it is a wound. A soft wound, raw and alive, bleeding curiosity. And tonight we gently touch that wound. We ask, is there a first cause? Is there a being that must exist, or is everything contingent, dependent, fragile, optional? Is there creation, or is there eternally being? These are not ideas to solve, they are echoes to live in. Many philosophers have stood here. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, proposed an unmoved mover, something that moves all things without being moved itself, something necessary, eternal. Thomas Aquinas followed, arguing that among all beings, those that are contingent, whose existence depends on something else, require a necessary being to ground their being. Leibniz spoke of the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists must have a reason for its existence, either in its own necessity or in something external. And yet scientists measure time, space, energy, matter, but such measures never reach why there is time at all, or why there is the frame in which measurement works. Quantum physics posits vacuums that are never empty, fluctuations that seem spontaneous. The vacuum seethes, flickers with possibility, even when stripped of particles. But a vacuum still presupposes laws, space, quantum fields. It presupposes structure, and structure presupposes something else. The mind recoils, because to ask who caused the cause, or what is it that exists necessarily, is to step into a place where logic strains its edges. Yet philosophers press on. The cosmological argument, in many forms, says there must have been something that did not begin, something that cannot not exist, something that explains all contingent things. Some call that God, some call that necessary being. Some say the question is malformed, that maybe beginning and cause are categories that only make sense inside existence. Maybe asking what happens before existence is like asking what's north of the North Pole. Nonsense. But that doesn't comfort the ache, because humans are creatures built to wonder, to feel the gap between what is and what might have been. The contingency of existence presses heavily. It means that everything you see, everything you know, everything you are could conceivably not be. The chair, the candlelight, the heartbeat, the questioner, the listener. None guaranteed. And that paradox, that everything might not have been, is both horrifying and liberating. It means things are more precious. It means existence is a gift, even if we don't know from whom or what. It means creation, if that word is permitted, is not over. Creation is always occurring. Every breath, every moment, every decision, every thought contemplates being, enacts being by being aware. And perhaps the first cause is not a being outside time, outside space, outside change, but the continual arising of existence itself. Perhaps being sustains itself in a mystery that requires no external hand, yet is no less wondrous. But that reply leads us to another question. If the first cause is itself necessary, what makes it necessary? If necessity means could not be, then necessity itself seems more primary than causation. We ask, is necessity a quality? Is it existence without conditions? Is it something like the unmoved mover, timeless, spaceless, changeless? Or is necessity just another word we invented to stop the regress? The mind invents labels: necessary, contingent, cause, effect, existence, non-existence. But maybe the boundary between them is thinner than we believe. Maybe contingency bleeds into necessity. Maybe something necessary shows itself only because everything else is contingent. And maybe necessity is visible only in the light cast by what might not have been. We see necessity in mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4. Logical truths. Perhaps truths about abstractions. But those truths are not the fullness of being. They are shadows. They are garments of necessity we wear to feel ground. Yet they neither build the stars nor cradle the heart. So the question returns, what pulls the thread? What is the ultimate explanation? Many say it is a personal being, a creator, an entity, outside existence who wills existence into being. Others say the universe is its own explanation, that being is necessary and contingent in ways we don't yet grasp. Still others say maybe we must accept the mystery. The existentialists say we must live as though existence has no why, or that the why is beyond us. Kierkegaard, though more concerned with Christian faith, spoke of the leap into faith because reason ends at the edge of existence. Heidegger said, being is that which questions itself. That being discloses being. That existence is not a problem to solve, but the ground from which any question arises. And perhaps psychology tells us that this question shapes identity, our sense of self, our fear of death, our urge to create, to love, to make meaning. These are responses to contingency. We build stories, rituals, myths to anchor ourselves in a sea of not necessariness. We invest in permanence, houses, relationships, reputations, because everything feels fragile. Because existence could dissolve into another set of laws, or none at all. And creativity, art, philosophy, love, they are forms of resistance, resistance to nothingness, resistance to the unknown that lurks under all certainties. And in resisting, we also worship, we affirm, we participate, we choose to be part of being, even if choice is small, even if choice is partial, because maybe choice itself is contingent, but the feeling that I am here, this chair, this breath, this question, all exist is part of that affirmation. And that might be enough, not to solve why anything exists, but to live knowing that it does, and to treat existence with the reverence it seems to request. In all its fragility, in all its mystery, in all its unexpected light, there is something softly insane about waking up each day without knowing why the day exists at all. The floor beneath the feet, the clock ticking its invisible circles, the smell of water in the sink. It's all there, undeniably there, and yet utterly unjustified. The question haunts in small places, in the silence between footsteps, in the soft clicking of an unplugged heater, in the way the sun stretches itself across a windowsill like it has a reason to, and it never explains itself. No knock on the door, no divine telegram saying, here is why anything exists, just the ongoing fact of being, like a song with no composer. And perhaps that is what existence is, a melody that began nowhere and refuses to stop, a vibration that echoes without source, looping in on itself like an Ouroboros, swallowing its own beginning, hiding the cause in the consequence. This is not an academic thought, it is a lived one. It moves through the body in moments of grief and awe, when a loved one dies and the world remains unchanged, when a stranger is kind for no reason, when laughter erupts during war, these are not contradictions. They are reminders that existence is weirder than explanation. That being is not a solution. It is the tension itself. And perhaps this is why the most ancient texts do not begin with answers, but with creation myths, with beginnings that are not beginnings, but poems. In the beginning, the void. In the beginning, the word. In the beginning, the egg. All metaphors, all stabs at a wound that cannot be sutured. Because humans are meaning-making machines with no clear manual. We are born into a story that lacks a preface, driven to write chapters into a book whose first page is missing. And so we build our own scaffolding. We say, maybe the universe always existed, or maybe it popped into being out of quantum nothing, or maybe a divine mind dreamt it into form, or maybe all this is a simulation and we're just sparks in a greater circuit. But all these answers, however dressed, rest on something unexplained. Even a simulation presupposes a simulator. Even a spontaneous quantum event presupposes the quantum field. Even the idea of eternal matter cannot explain why it should exist rather than remain unrealized. And so the philosopher returns, again and again, to the dark room of thought, where nothing is settled and everything glows with question. Spinoza called existence a single substance with infinite attributes. For him, God and nature were the same, eternal and self-causing, needing no external source. He didn't believe God created the world. God was the world. But even that feels like a metaphysical shrug, like renaming the mystery and pretending it answers itself. Because if being causes itself, what does cause mean anymore? If necessity is just what happens to be permanent, does it explain or just endure? The mind tightens, language buckles, and yet something remains. The feeling, the eerie presence of presence, that perhaps the answer isn't in the origin, but in the texture of being itself, the way it unfolds, the way it holds contradiction, like a flame cupped in the palm. Being is both violent and tender, vast and intimate, lawful and chaotic. A child is born, and a star collapses, and a fish changes colour, and someone makes coffee, and somewhere, deep in the Andes, a stone splits without sound. And none of these are more justified than the next. They are simply part of what is. And to sit in that truth, not to fix it, not to escape it, but to feel it, requires a kind of courage that few philosophies teach. It is the courage of not knowing. The courage to admit that maybe the deepest parts of existence cannot be known in the way we usually mean. They can only be witnessed, tasted, cried over, danced inside, and maybe that's the beginning of wisdom. Not a path to answers, but a softening of the need for them. A humility before the fact that reality is not obligated to explain itself to the tiny mind that emerged within it. That maybe mystery is not a temporary glitch, but the very frame of the whole play. And still we return. Still we ask, because asking is part of being. Because wonder is a function of life. Because to cease wondering is to fall asleep in the most dangerous way. And perhaps that's what this chapter is. Not a lesson, but a lullaby for the soul that cannot stop asking. A recognition of the ache that lives beneath thought. A soft voice in the dark that whispers, yes, it's strange. Yes, it makes no sense. And yes, you are not alone in feeling that. The philosophers felt it. The mystics lived it. The poets wept it into pages. The scientists glimpsed it in formulas that danced without feet. No one knows why anything exists, but we all carry the question like a lantern. And in the soft flicker of those shared flames, maybe that is enough. Enough to keep walking, enough to keep wondering, enough to let the mystery be not an enemy, but a home. Every so often, someone pauses mid-sentence, looks up from their screen, or stands frozen at the edge of their thoughts and feels it. That quiet pull, that odd vibration, humming beneath everything. as if the world is slightly translucent and something else is glowing just behind it. That's the strange familiarity of the question. Why is there something rather than nothing? It doesn't shout. It doesn't knock. It lingers. It waits in the gaps between chores and chatter, a presence that offers no answers, only more being. And maybe that's what makes it unbearable to some and beautiful to others. It touches the most ancient part of the human psyche, the place before story, before memory, before the comfort of names. It is the metaphysical hunger every child feels the first time they realize they were born into something already in motion. It is the suspicion that all explanations are built on air, and that the air itself has no foundation. And yet we keep building. Cathedrals, equations, theories, all in pursuit of what began it all. But even the idea of a beginning is suspicious. A beginning assumes time. It assumes change. It assumes that before this, there was that. But what if time itself was part of the illusion? What if time didn't come first? What if time is a symptom, not a source? The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that time and space are not things in themselves, but forms of intuition, ways our minds structure experience. In other words, the mind cannot help but perceive things as happening in time. But that does not mean time is fundamental. Perhaps the whole frame of causation, this caused that, which caused this, is just the shape our cognition wraps around the raw chaos of being. And if that's true, then asking what caused existence might be like asking what colour is jealousy, a category mistake. And yet the question remains, not as a logical puzzle, but as a human ache. Because behind every question about the cosmos is a question about the self. Why am I here? Why this moment? Why not nothing? The 20th century French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called it nausea, the feeling that existence itself is gratuitous, that it hangs there, unnecessary, unjustified. To him, it was absurd. To others, it was divine. Simone Weil, another French thinker, saw existence as a form of love. Not romantic love, but something deeper. A love that gives without reason, a love that sustains without needing to be seen. In that view, being itself is an act of giving. A gift, but a gift from whom? Or from what? And does it matter? If a gift arrives with no sender, no explanation, is it any less a gift? Or perhaps it is more so, free from obligation, free from story, just pure, silent generosity. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "Being here is so much, just that. No theory, no argument, just awe, just gratitude, just the overwhelming awareness that this breath, this touch, this thought exists. And in that existence is the whole mystery." The physicist Sean Carroll once said that asking, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" might be the wrong question. Maybe the better question is, what kind of something is there? In his view, the laws of physics don't forbid existence. In fact, existence seems more natural than non-existence. But even that answer doesn't calm the deeper part of us, the part that wants not just laws but meaning, not just patterns but purpose. And that may be where science ends and philosophy begins. Because the need for purpose is not a flaw in reasoning, it is a feature of being human. And yet, meaning is not found, it is made. Made in the way two people meet eyes across a room. Made in the silence after music ends. Made in the decision to plant a tree one will never see bloom. And perhaps that is the response to the mystery. Not a solution, but a stance. Not an answer, but a way of being. To live as if existence is sacred, even if it is accidental. To live as if being is a miracle, even if it is meaningless. To treat the world not as a riddle to be solved, but as a poem to be read aloud slowly. Because maybe the why is not in the origin, but in the unfolding. Not in the first cause, but in the daily texture. In the way coffee warms the throat. In the way sleep erases time. In the way someone smiles without knowing they've just changed everything. That's where the mystery lives now. Not in the stars, not in ancient tomes, but in the quiet weight of everyday being. And if that's not enough, then perhaps nothing ever will be. But if it is enough, then everything changes. The world becomes not a problem, but a presence. Not a machine, but a miracle. Not a question, but a companion. And to walk with that companion, to let existence be what it is without needing it to be more, might be the beginning of peace. A peace that does not explain, but embraces. A peace that does not fix, but honours. A peace that says, I do not know why there is something, but I am here. And that is already everything. Imagine a world where absolutely nothing exists. No matter, no time, no space, not even darkness, because darkness is something. Not even emptiness, because emptiness is still a place. Just nothing. The human mind can't truly picture it. Try it. What comes up is always something. Blackness, a void, a blank expanse. But those are still scenes. They still have texture, background, the suggestion of perception. True nothingness has no stage to be imagined upon. And perhaps that's part of the cosmic joke. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, might be unanswerable precisely because there has never been true nothingness for us to compare being to. We are creatures of being. Our every thought, every breath, every sensation is saturated with it. Being is the medium we swim in. And yet we ask this question as if we stand outside it, peering back through some theoretical lens into a realm of absence. But absence is not a state. It is not a place. It is not a precondition. It is not anything. And maybe that's the answer, that nothingness was never an option, that the very concept is a contradiction. But if that's true, if something must exist, then the next question is why this something? Why this world, these laws, this strange collection of stars and suffering and silence? That's where the contingency creeps back in. Because even if being is necessary, the shape of this being, the texture of it, the feel of it, the rules it plays by, seems wildly specific, arbitrary even. Why gravity? Why love? Why pain? Why bananas and black holes and Beethoven? Why should any of these particular things arise from the supposed necessity of being? And here the idea of brute fact emerges. A brute fact is something that simply is. No further explanation, no deeper reason. It exists because it does, and there's nothing more to say. Some philosophers argue that the existence of the universe is a brute fact. Full stop. End of sentence. And that's a deeply unsatisfying thought. But maybe dissatisfaction isn't a bug. Maybe it's a feature. Because dissatisfaction drives curiosity. It drives art. It drives rebellion and wonder and restlessness and romance. To feel that something is missing is what makes us human. And in a way, the idea of brute fact mirrors the mystic's insight. The mystic doesn't say the world makes sense. The mystic says the world is what it is, and to witness it fully is enough. Eckhart said, God is a great underground river, and all religions are cups. He didn't mean there's one explanation. He meant there's one mystery, flowing beneath all forms. And perhaps that mystery is being itself. Not an object, not an answer, but a current, a movement, a verb. The theologian Paul Tillich called God the ground of being. Not a being among beings, not a supreme entity, but the very condition of existence, the fact that anything is rather than is not. That's not a God you pray to, it's a God you breathe, a God you can't escape because it is being itself. But even if one rejects theology, the insight remains. That being is not just a backdrop, it is not passive, it is dynamic, it unfolds, it expresses, and we in our tiny lives are part of that expression. The painter paints, the parent comforts, the child dreams, the builder constructs, all as echoes of that first mysterious gesture, being. And yet we're also haunted by the possibility that none of it means anything, that the whole cosmic orchestra is playing a tune without a listener, that the stage is vast and the audience is empty. That's the dark side of being, the nihil, the void that grins behind the curtain. Nietzsche saw it. He called it the abyss. But he didn't flinch. He said if the universe is meaningless, then it is up to us to give it meaning. Not by pretending, but by creating. By dancing on the grave of certainty. By saying yes to life in all its terror and beauty. That is what he meant by amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but passionate embrace. And maybe that's the truest response to the mystery of existence. Not to solve it, not to pierce it, but to love it. Fiercely, softly, stubbornly. To love being without needing it to explain itself. To wake up each morning, stretch one's arms into the air, and say, I don't know why I am here, but I am. And so I will laugh, I will grieve, I will build, I will hold someone's hand, I will look at the stars, I will be confused, and I will keep asking, because asking is part of being. And maybe that's the real answer, that the question itself is an expression of being, that curiosity is what being does when it notices itself. And so the mystery isn't something we'll solve one day and then rest. It is the resting itself. The resting inside the question. The willingness to live without closure. To burn with wonder rather than freeze in doubt. And in that fire, perhaps, is a light, not a blinding one, not a cold one, but a candlelight, gentle, flickering, enough to see the next step, enough to keep walking, and maybe, just maybe, enough to fall in love with the whole strange, unjustified fact of being. There is a peculiar silence that arrives when the mind has stared too long into the idea of nothingness. It's not the silence of peace, it's the silence of reaching the end of language, the edge of explanation, where every word collapses into itself, like a star folding into a singularity. There are no answers there, only echoes. The echo of why, repeated softly, endlessly, like a prayer no God ever responds to. But that doesn't mean it is meaningless. In fact, that might be the most meaningful part of all. The endurance of the question, the refusal to be extinguished, the way it haunts the spaces between thoughts, refusing to let existence be taken for granted. This is what the philosopher Martin Heidegger tried to express when he said, the fundamental question of metaphysics is not what is, but why is there being at all, and not rather nothing. That question, for him, was not just a thought, it was a mood, a sense of strangeness, of uncanniness, that the world is not natural but odd, not obvious but bewildering. To exist is not neutral, it is uncanny, it is suspicious, it is a trembling on the edge of impossibility, and yet it continues, relentlessly. The world insists on being moment after moment, with no clear invitation, no known origin, no obvious need. And we, the temporary sparks of awareness, who find ourselves inside this being, try to make sense of it with our little minds. We create cosmologies, we build religions, we develop metaphysics, but none of them are quite enough. They are beautiful, they are wise, they are sometimes true, but they are not the whole. They are scaffolding around a void, and that void is not empty, it is humming. It is full of potential, it is fertile with not knowing, and that's what makes it holy. Not because it gives us comfort, but because it refuses to lie. The mystics knew this. They said God is not something you can know, but something you can fall into, a presence that destroys all concepts, a fire that burns away the ego until only awe remains. Meister Eckhart said, God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. Strip away every answer, strip away every category, strip away even the self. What's left is being, raw, radiant, terrifying being. And maybe that's what we've been circling all along. Not a cause, not an origin, but a presence, an intimacy with being itself, not as a puzzle, not as a doctrine, but as an experience, to sit quietly and simply feel that one exists, that everything exists, that something somehow is. That is the most immediate miracle, not walking on water, not turning water into wine, but water itself. That water exists at all, that anything does. And this is not just poetic talk, it is the deepest thing there is. Because every other fact rests on this one. Every science, every history, every moment of love or loss, all of it presupposes that being is real, that something is here, and that here is a place, and that time moves, and that minds emerge, and that we care. None of that is necessary. All of it could have been otherwise, and yet it is. And so we return to the question with reverence, not arrogance, not to conquer it, but to kneel before it, not to solve it, but to be reshaped by it. Because in the end, maybe the best thing the question can do is not lead us to an answer, but lead us back to life, to the rawness of now, to the weirdness of breath, to the aching beauty of being temporary creatures in a world that didn't need to be, but is. And what does one do in the face of such mystery? Perhaps the only honest response is to live with depth, with presence, with humility, to live like each moment is undeserved, because it is, to look at a tree and realize it is a miracle, to taste food and remember that atoms arrange themselves into flavor, to hear music and know that vibration somehow became emotion. These are not trivial things. They are the response. They are the way being speaks back to itself, through us, through our hands, through our tears, through the stories we tell. And maybe the greatest story is not one that explains being, but one that celebrates it, one that sings it, one that mourns it, one that dances with it in the night, even when the music stops, even when no one is watching. Because being is not a performance, it is a gift. And like all true gifts, it asks for nothing in return. Only that we notice, only that we say thank you, even if we don't know to whom. Only that we keep asking, even if we never hear the answer. Only that we keep being, even if we don't understand how. Every philosophy eventually ends in silence. Not because it fails, but because it reaches a place beyond words, a space where the mind recognizes its own limits and bows. This final chapter is not a conclusion, but a circling back, a gentle repetition of the first breath that ever asked, why? Why does anything exist? Why is there something here, and not just an endless, effortless nothing? It's a question that doesn't just live in books or lectures, but inside every long stare, every sleepless night, every moment of heartbreak or astonishment. And perhaps that's where its true power lies, not in answers, but in its persistence. The question itself is proof of being. It means the universe has, somehow, arranged atoms into a creature that can doubt its own presence, that can look at the stars and ask where they came from, then look inward and wonder the same. No other animal asks this. No forest ponders its own growth. No river questions its own flow. But humans, fragile, chaotic, terrified humans, cannot stop. The search for meaning is etched into the bones. And yet, despite millennia of asking, no definitive answer has emerged. Not from gods, not from science, not from the mouth of the void itself. Leibniz once said the ultimate reason for everything must lie in a necessary being, something that contains the reason for its existence within itself. But that concept too leads to silence, because what does it mean for something to be necessary? What does it mean for existence to explain itself? If being explains being, has anything really been explained? Or have we just traced the riddle in prettier shapes? The physicist Lawrence Krauss argued that something can indeed come from nothing, that quantum fields fluctuate, birthing particles from apparent void. But even those fields are something, and so the question returns. Always it returns. Even when wrapped in mathematics or metaphysics or myth, it always circles back to the impossible. Pure nothing. Not empty, not silent, not dark, but utterly not. And if such nothingness cannot even be imagined, then perhaps it was never an option at all. Perhaps being is not a surprise. Perhaps it is inevitable. But if so, then what is its cost? Why must inevitability contain so much pain, So much beauty, so much indifference. The same universe that allows Mozart also allows Auschwitz. The same being that births love also births loss. This is the brutal contradiction of existence. It is generous but not gentle. It is full but not fair. And that too demands response. Not escape, not delusion, but response. And that response can take many forms. For the Stoics, it was acceptance. For Marcus Aurelius, the universe was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was, and the task of the human was to align with its rhythms. To be a small part in a vast whole. For Camus, it was rebellion. If the universe is absurd, then the only dignity lies in defiance, in living with eyes wide open, without appeal to fantasy. For Kierkegaard, it was a leap of faith, not as surrender to dogma, but as the only honest response to a mystery that reason cannot pierce. And perhaps for us tonight, it is simply to listen, to breathe, to recognize that this question, why anything exists, is not a curse but a kind of intimacy. It means the universe is aware of itself at least once, through you, through the soft mechanisms of thought, through the ancient fire of curiosity that refuses to die. It flickers even now, and maybe that's the meaning, if there is one. That being is not a static condition, but a relationship, a dialogue, a dance, one side unknown, the other asking. The candle burns, the question is whispered, and in that flicker of flame and thought the whole cosmos leans in, and still no answer comes. Only being, always being. And in that presence, raw, unjustified, tender, maybe the question has already done its work. It has brought us here. It has broken the trance of the ordinary. It has opened a crack in the shell of the world and let the night in. Not to scare, but to remind. That the darkness is part of the story too. That not knowing is a kind of knowing. That silence is not absence, it is depth. It is a room without walls, and we sit in it together for just a moment longer, listening, wondering, existing.